It's Friday, October 4th, 2024, and we are 31 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. On this week's show, we are talking about election security. I thought with the recent filing from Special Counsel Jack Smith outlining his case for the things that Trump did to undermine the 2020 election being unsealed, it might be a good time to talk about what we know is happening now and what election officials are saying about how safe our elections actually are, which is why my guest this week is Tina Barton. She's a former Michigan election clerk, advisor to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and now the senior expert for the nonprofit Elections Group. But first, let's get to your headlines. On Tuesday, former President Jimmy Carter turned 100 years old, becoming the first U.S. president to live that long. Carter has been in hospice care since February of 2023 and celebrated with his family and friends at his home in Georgia. His grandson told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that President Carter said he wanted to stay alive until October 15th when early voting started so that he would be able to vote for Kamala Harris. Also on Tuesday, Iran launched a barrage of missiles at Israel in retaliation for the bombings and airstrikes in Beirut, Lebanon that killed dozens, including several leaders of the Iranian-backed terror group Hezbollah, but also many civilians. The Iranian missiles were intercepted by Israel's air defense system known as the Iron Dome, with the help of U.S. forces as well. And on Wednesday, Israeli forces launched an invasion into Lebanon, which has resulted in deaths on both sides and has left some in the international community concerned about the scope of Israel's fighting along all of its borders. Also on Tuesday, it was a busy day for news this week. A Texas attorney came forward with 120 new sexual misconduct allegations against music mogul Sean Combs. He said he'd been contacted by as many as 3,000 people with stories, though. That attorney said the allegations that he'll be presenting are from 60 men and 60 women, including 25 of them who were minors at the time of the alleged misconduct. He also said that many of the incidents happened at well-known New York clubs or venues and that more than half were reported to police or hospitals at the time they allegedly occurred, and officials looked the other way. The lawsuit is expected to be filed next week. On Wednesday, President Joe Biden sent 1,000 active duty Army troops to North Carolina to help with the rescue and recovery efforts as communities across the Southeast and Appalachia continue to recover from Hurricane and Tropical Storm Helene. And as I'm recording this, the death toll from Helene has now risen to 215 people, and there are fears that more bodies may still be found as rescuers continue to struggle with reaching cities and towns that were effectively made remote by raging floodwaters. And while that's been happening, there have been growing calls for Congress to come back into session or for the president to call Congress into a special session to fund FEMA, which was left out of the last funding bill to avoid the government shutdown. I talked about that a little earlier last week. And while Biden is reportedly mulling the idea over, Republican leadership in Congress has pushed back against that idea. Now, finally, on Thursday, the International Longshoremen's Association, the union for tens of thousands of dock workers up and down the East Coast, who struck on Tuesday, agreed to suspend the strike after the shipping company organization came back with a 62% increase in pay offer. Now, the actual number there, not just the percentage, is less than what the union was asking for, but it was enough to bring both sides back to the negotiating table to hammer out the rest of the contract. That is, hopefully they can hammer it out before the suspension ends on January 15th. Okay, those are your headlines, and now let's get to our main topic this week, the efforts already underway to undermine the 2024 election and how safe election officials say our votes actually are. So, like I said at the beginning, with the recent evidence laid out in the new filing from Jack Smith about Trump's efforts to undermine the 2020 election, I thought it was worth looking at how that's already happening now. Since last year, election officials and advocates for free and fair elections have been sounding alarm bells about threats to the 2024 election, ranging from foreign interference, which I'll get to in just a bit, to conspiracy theorists trying to tamper with election equipment, to legal challenges that could erode trust in secure processes and lead to violence. And the top driver of that is saying the election will be rigged. And that's what Donald Trump and Republicans across the country have been laying the groundwork to do. And I want to say here, this is going to be about what Republicans are doing because they're the ones saying and doing these things. And I know that there are a lot of conspiracies out there about how Democrats are giving, let's say, undocumented immigrants IDs to vote or the right to vote to try to cheat or steal the election, but those have been levied at Democrats for decades and have never turned out to be true. But what is true is that it is Donald Trump and Republicans across the board and across the country who are saying it's their opponents who are trying to cheat and saying that there is somehow a worry that our elections weren't free and fair the last time and won't be this time. And I also know that there were Democratic challenges in 2016 and in other previous elections, but those didn't reach the level of Trump's claims, and I'm not going to indulge in whataboutism any more than this, except to say that two wrongs don't make a right, and we can be critical about attempts in the past and ones made now. Okay, so for months now, Trump has refused to say that he would accept the results of the election no matter the outcome. He refused to say it in interviews and has been laying the groundwork to say that if he loses, it's only because Democrats cheated. Here's what he said at a recent rally in Michigan.
If I lose, I'll tell you what's possible, because they cheat. That's the only way we're going to lose, because they cheat. They cheat like hell.
Trump has repeated that claim many times, and on top of not accepting the 2020 results, his supporters believe it. A brand new poll from PBS and Marist College that came out yesterday found almost 90% of his supporters said they were worried about voter fraud in the election, and it's also trickled out into the broader public, with 60% of all voters saying they had concerns about voter fraud, which I've talked about this before, but even the most conservative groups that looked at this, who were looking for voter fraud, found that it doesn't happen on a scale anywhere near large enough to sway elections or really make any kind of a difference. And numerous federal agencies run by Trump appointees and independent audits found that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. But nonetheless, Trump has repeated those claims, stoking fear and doubt among voters of all stripes. He's also been undermining mail-in voting again, despite the fact that it's routinely considered just as safe as in-person voting, a fact that was borne out in the 2020 election, where we had more mail-in votes than ever before because of COVID. We had more mail-in votes than in-person votes that year because of COVID. And Trump has been saying that mail-in votes could be tampered with because the Postal Service admitted it was a poorly run mess. So the Postal Service never said anything like that. It's also currently being run by a man that he appointed. And again, the post office handled the most votes by mail in 2020 without a problem. Trump has also said that there's no voter verification on overseas or military ballots, which again isn't true. They're verified the same as any other vote by mail or absentee ballot. He's also said that election officials will use early voting, absentee, or mail-in voting to cheat and make him lose. Again, there is no evidence that that's something that is happening or has happened. And when it comes to the election itself, Trump has been saying that Biden dropping out and Democrats nominating Harris in his place is unconstitutional, therefore somehow nullifying any would-be election outcome. He said it at rallies and in at least one Truth Social post from back in August, where he said Harris unconstitutionally stole the nomination for Biden. Again, that's not true. There is nothing illegal nor unconstitutional with what the Democratic Party did. It also didn't violate party rules either. But all of this that Trump has been saying are just little, drip, drip, drips that erode people's trust in the upcoming election. And it's not just him. Republican parties and organizations across the country are doubling down alongside him. Right now, there are more than 120 lawsuits being pushed by the Republican National Convention in 26 different states across the country, which they say are aimed at restoring faith in elections by ensuring that people aren't voting illegally. Experts say because there's no actual evidence of people voting illegally in a meaningful way, it actually does the opposite and undermines faith in elections. One expert from Columbia Law School telling Reuters this is part of creating a narrative that there will be irregularities that will require outside intervention. Another lawsuit being brought by the America First Legal Foundation is actively suing Arizona to see if they can get a new legal theory approved, which would allow judges to throw out whole votes over small failures or irregularities made by local election officials. Now, Irregularities or failures are common, and there are often legal ways to remedy those things that are built into state laws across the country because these processes are done by people, and people make mistakes from time to time. That's why these sort of remedy processes are built in. In fact, it's why a lot of places move to things like vote tabulating machines and voting machines because they're more accurate than hand-counting ballots and make fewer mistakes. The Republican Party has also set up what they're calling election integrity monitoring operations in at least 15 different states from what I could find, where they plan on having 100,000 volunteers to monitor the election at every step of the process in those places and set up hotlines for those people who suspect they're witnessing fraud or tampering to then speak with conservative lawyers. Now, claims about fraud in 2020 that came from unofficial poll watchers were pretty common because they said that they saw fraud, but the vast majority were found in courts to be poll watchers just not understanding the process of how elections work, or in many other cases because they were there actively looking for fraud instead of just watching the process. They found fraud where there wasn't any. Maybe the most high-profile case came out of Georgia, where an election worker was seen passing a candy to another election worker, and Rudy Giuliani went to several different states to say that they were passing a flash drive to commit voter fraud. All of that, again, are just little ways in which the election gets undermined, because by telling people that there will be fraud, fraud is what they're going to see, and that combined with a political party that's already working to gum up the election in the courts could be a recipe to sow more doubt. Now, finally, congressional Republicans are also sowing doubt, which is cause for alarm, because they're the ones who are in charge of actually certifying the election, making the results official. When he was asked last week, Speaker Mike Johnson refused to say whether he'd still certify the election, even if Harris won. Here's what he said.
Speaker, do you commit to observing regular order in the certification process of the 2024 election, even if Kamala Harris beats Donald Trump?
Well, of course, if we have a free, fair, and safe election, we're going to follow the Constitution. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So I know that sounds like he's saying yes, but what he's saying by making it conditional there on a free and fair election is saying that there's the potential that it could be anything other than those things when we don't have evidence of it not being free and fair on a scale that would matter. It's leaving the door open to a thing that Mike Johnson knows isn't true. Now, Johnson was also a chief legal architect of one of the biggest lawsuits to overturn the 2020 election and has refused to say that Biden won in 2020. So that also needs to be understood when he says things like what you just heard. Okay, let's move away from the Republican Party and Trump and talk about the threat from foreign actors. Most recently, the FBI confirmed that Iranian hackers did hack the Trump campaign and leak documents to various media outlets, which didn't publish them right away. And those documents were also sent to the then Biden campaign, which, according to officials, did not respond to the hackers. Trump went so far as to say that the Harris campaign spied on him via those hackers, although, again, they didn't respond, according to the FBI and the DOJ, so there's no evidence that anything like that even happened. 3 Iranians have been indicted by the DOJ for the hacking attempt, but it has raised concerns about foreign attempts to interfere in the election. But because of that, the director of the U.S. Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, or CISA, told the AP that they had made so much progress building up their protections that there was no way Iran or Russia or any other outside actor could influence the election, saying malicious actors, even if they tried, could not have an impact at a scale such that there would be a material effect on the outcome of the election. Now, the final concern here, we're going to go from global to local. And it's not a malicious one either. It's that in 2020, there were so many threats and death threats sent to election workers that thousands just said they'd had enough. And a lot of those positions haven't been filled, leaving a vacuum of sorts in a lot of local election offices. And those are the folks who actually run your elections. And the worry is that could mean just more regular human error because there are fewer workers, but work is being done to shore that up and provide resources, which brings us to my guest today, former Election Assistance Commission advisor and current senior advisor to the election group, Tina Barton. I guess like let's talk about your path from election clerk, which is when I met you, to the EAC and now the elections group, and then tell me a little bit about what the elections group actually does.
Yeah, so I left being the Rochester Hills City Clerk around March of 2021. I went to work for the federal government at the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Was able to create the first ever clearinghouse division, which is a division who creates all the resources for the EAC. And I've spent about a year and a half there. And the opportunity came up with the elections group to come on as a senior election expert. So the elections group is a group of about 20 former election officials from all over the country, various states, some coming from state government, some coming from county and then local government. But all of us having worked as election administrators at some point in our career, most of us coming straight from there to the elections group. And so we do a lot of things of providing resources, best practices, guidance on things like audits, chain of custody. I do specifically for me, I actually spend a lot of my time working with the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections.
So for you, that means you're on the ground working with election officials right now. What are you hearing from them in terms of the things that they're worried about when it comes to repeats of 2020? Because that's what this episode has been about. Listeners will have just heard on the podcast me go through a lot of the stuff that Trump and Republicans have been saying frequently, like a lot of the legal groundwork too, and then as well as foreign threats. And then the thing that I've talked about before in the podcast too is that after 2020, because of all the threats, there was this mass exodus of election workers, and we can kind of get into these things individually. But what are you hearing the most from election workers and their worries right now?
Yeah, so I think election officials are worried on a lot of different fronts. I mean, we're still and after 2016, we were hyper focused on everything that was cybersecurity related. So we spent a lot of time in training on cyber issues, and then in 2020, we ended up with these death threats, with harassment, and they were things that even as we got past 2020 into 2022, and then still continuing, it was not a one-off. So we realized that what happened in 2020, the threats to election officials, was something that was continuing to go on. So for a lot of them, it's the concern they have about their own physical safety as well as that of their staff members, but also the safety and security of the process. Right. They're out there to champion the process and not the outcome. And so they want to make sure that every eligible voter is able to do so in a way that is free, fair, and secure and done with integrity and accuracy. And so their concerns are that voters will feel safe doing that, will feel that there's a secure environment for them. So there are a lot of different fronts on that. They're concerned about mis and disinformation, of trying to battle that when they're incredibly busy trying to do their jobs. It's impossible for one location on its own, especially, here in Michigan, where we're hyper decentralized, where the cities and townships are running the elections, to be able to fight those battles, right? Most of them don't have PIOs, communications officers, or teams. And so they're like trying to, like, as something pops up on Facebook or, a neighbor stops them in the grocery store, trying to kind of attack that information, in those environments. But they certainly, it's something that nobody has the resource to do on their own.
And I think the thing that always gets me about this is that, like you said, these are people who are our neighbors, who live in our communities, who you can bump into, at a school function or a game or at the grocery store. And they're not somebody operating in the abstract or in the shadows. How do you work with election officials to get that part across? Because, as I guess a bit of optimism for me, I like to think that people will hopefully turn down some of that temperature when you can kind of humanize the process a little bit. Is that one of the ways to do this?
Absolutely. And that's been one of my concerns, is that I feel that the individuals who administer the process and others have been dehumanized in this. That they are no longer Tina, who's somebody's, wife, mother, grandmother, all of those things. I'm the enemy because I'm the person who administered an election where their candidate lost. And so I think what I feel we have to do too is keep an eye on the ball, the fact that this is very localized, right? And keep promoting that message that the people who work in your election official's office are people who also live in your county and your community, right? The people who are the poll workers that you go to and you see in the school gym, these are people who live in your community. They probably are grandparents of kids that, go to school with your kids, or you see them, like you said, at soccer games or places like that. So these aren't people coming from far away to come in and mess with your elections. These are people people you already have relationships with, and they're doing it in the most bipartisan way possible. And something that I think the only time in this country where we're actually seeing Democrats and Republicans come together in numbers or even in small groups and agree on something, right? So you have Democrats and Republicans working at the poll together, and they're agreeing that yes, this person is an eligible voter. Yes, we issued 100 ballots, and yes, 100 ballots went through the tabulator. And at the end of the night, they're all signing off that they saw all the same seal numbers, that they sealed all the new things with the same seal numbers. They're putting their names on all of these things together, Republicans and Democrats. There is nothing else or no other time in this country, especially right now, where you're seeing that happen. Families can't even come together sometimes at the table without having conversation that like sparks, anger, and they don't agree on something, right? When it comes to the whole politics of it, the poll workers put that aside. They're there to serve their country. They're there to serve their community. They're doing a service. And that's what they're doing, is a community service to everyone who lives in the community, for everyone who lives in the community they live in.
Sure. How concerned are you about things when it comes to the process of the election? The I will just talk to, I can't remember the actual name of it, the election monitoring, I guess, operation that the Republican National Committee is putting out there, and I think about 15 states, where they want someone or a bunch of people to be at the polls and at the counting and tabulation kind of every step of the way, with like a direct line to a group of legal attorneys or conservative attorneys. How concerned are you about those kinds of things showing up at polls and getting in the way of the election process or stopping voters from voting?
So, I mean, first of all, I mean, I do want to say up front, right? Challengers and observers are something that are part of the process
Yes.
and should be there. My concern at any level is that any bad actor is intentionally disrupting, whether it's at the precinct or some other place, whether it's through them sending fentanyl through the mail, whether it's, doing a swatting of some place. The intent is to disrupt. And if the intent is to disrupt, yes, that's a concern for me. If the intent is to help be in a transparent process, that I'm supportive of the way that that's just the way our country works. That's the way we run elections here. Yes. Are there concerns about that? But I would also say that election officials have been training for a long time for various scenarios to take place, and they're having better communication with their poll workers. They're training them better in education and de-escalation techniques. And I think a lot of what we will see out there are things that can be maybe attended to by someone being educated about the process. Hey, what you think you're seeing is actually the way it works, and this is why it works that way.
I'm going to move on from some of the domestic stuff here. The threat of like AI and the threat of foreign actors trying to hack into elections somehow. I know that the head of CISA said that no country could actually ever do that right now. But how good are we with combating cyber attacks and then sort of this new threat of AI that's emerging into the election space?
That there are so many layers there that I think I mean, I firmly agree, obviously, with Jen Easterly and her comments of what she had to say. When it comes to AI, that is probably a little bit more frightening to me. Number one, because it's new, right? We're just kind of like learning everything that it can do. And when you can see how easily it can take somebody like you or me who has been on TV multiple times and take just short clips of us and put it in a loop. And all of a sudden now this looks like a video that's coming from Tina Barton or that's coming from you. And it looks like us. And if you're not intimately familiar with our gestures, our body movements, our habits, you might look at that and say, oh my God, I can't believe Grant just said that, because it's
Right.
going to look so much like you. But somebody who knows you, that's very close to you, a good friend or a family member, they'd be like, yeah, he doesn't like always jerk his arm that way when he, you know what I'm saying? It's like, he doesn't twitch like that when he does that,
Right,
it's
right.
like, because they know you. But when you don't, that's the kind of thing that makes me a little nervous. Also, clerks, especially, like, our voices are out there from town meetings and city and council meetings, things like that, how easily they can take a voice and maybe mislead voters or mislead poll workers with using their voice. It sounds like the clerk.
Right now, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about how either our elections are approached or the process itself, what would that be? And is there a path for us to actually get there?
A magic wand for me is they would be funded better. In 2017, we declared them to be critical infrastructure, and I don't think we have funded them that way yet. And so that is a concern for me, that we still have money that needs to trickle down to the very local level for all things. If you have more funding, then you have better physical security, you have better cyber security. If you have more funding, you have more staff. You're less likely to make errors, those sorts of things. And so to me, a lot of that comes from funding, can help, if not cure all of those things, would at least make them easier to deal with, or might harden your facilities more, that make it harder for somebody else to penetrate in some way.
And the last thing is, for someone like me, the average voter who's not going to be on the other side of the glass on this thing, how can we help? Is it volunteering? How can we help if we're not going to volunteer? Because I think everybody wants the temperature to be turned down, and I think everybody wants to make sure that this election runs smoothly. So how do we do that?
I think a couple of things. I think number one, you become a poll worker, right? The best way to learn something is to immerse yourself in the middle of it, to actually do it. And I think it also will help, all of those things that you've wondered about, or you've been curious about, or maybe even lies that you've believed. It might help you learn that, hey, that's not actually how that operates. And yeah, maybe that did look like it's a problem, but now I understand why they're doing that. It can help really clear all that up for you. And then as a poll worker, what you can do then is become a disciple, right? Like, be a convert. Like, we brought you in, we showed you how the process works. Now you believe it, you see it yourself, and you can go out and tell other people, hey, listen, you remember when you said this? No, that's not how that actually works, because this is what I learned and this is what we did. And I think that people will believe other people that they know who've actually experienced something or done something. So again, it's get engaged in the process yourself and then go share it with other people.
Well, consider me converted then, Tina. I really appreciate your time.
I'll let you know where to send the offering.
I gave it the office. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
It's great to see you. I hope you're well.
I want to thank Tina again for coming on the show. If you're curious about the work that's being done by the elections group, there's a link to their page in the show notes. And now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long Tuned Out, where I'll tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. For months now, Donald Trump and Republicans have been laying the groundwork to undermine and sow doubt in the 2024 election should Trump lose. Trump has repeatedly said that the only way he could lose is if Democrats cheat, while also undermining mail-in voting and election processes, despite the elections being safer than they've ever been. The Republican Party is also currently suing 120 different lawsuits across the country for what they say are about election security concerns, but legal experts say because there's no threat to security, those lawsuits are actually serving to undermine that security. They're also planning on putting thousands of so-called election monitors in states across the country to watch for fraud with a direct line to conservative lawyers. Election officials and democracy advocates are worried that could cause voter intimidation and could actually make elections less secure. And the Speaker of the House has refused to say that Biden won and wouldn't commit to following the law to certify the election. Outside of the domestic stuff, while there have been attempts to affect this year's U.S. election from countries like Iran and Russia, the head of U.S. cybersecurity has said that things had become so secure that they would never be able to affect the election in a meaningful way. And because 2020 was so traumatic for so many election officials and workers, many just left their jobs altogether, and the real worry about the election is that those vacancies could lead to an increase in human mistake and could mean counting votes could take longer, which would only open the door further to people hoping to undermine the real results. Okay, that is it for today's Make It Make Sense. Please follow, rate, and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen on. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I'll have an extended interview with Tina up tomorrow morning. And as always, share the show on social media and follow it there too. It really helps spread the word about the work that we're doing here, especially since we are so close to the election. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod. All one word on every platform. Tag me in that too. It's at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.